This book is, as I said, my father's story, really. It's not, there are a few pages at the beginning that I share the relevancy, I think, of these letters in contemporary terms. But I see these letters having a value on three and a fourth level, actually, a level that I haven't really talked as much about as I should. The first level is, of course, the art of writing a letter, in a sense. Larry's sense of just wonderful language. Today, with modern technology being what it is, all of these wonderful thoughts you may share with loved ones end up in the ether somewhere. They will never again be recorded or captured in a way. Given the constraints of communication, the limitations on them, the ability to share one's innermost thoughts with someone you care deeply about, the person you care most deeply about in the world, is something I think we'll deeply regret in years to come. And we'll miss, in a sense, how people feel about each other in contemporary times or future generations. So this book, in a sense, gives us a wonderful window just to hear the voice of another human being, sharing his thoughts and feelings about the person he cared the most of his life. I've often said growing up that while we were 6 children, when my mother and father were with each other, there was no doubt in my mind growing up who the 2 most important people in the world were to each other. And while we were important about any question whatsoever, their affection and caring for each other superseded their love and affection for their children, which knew no limits in many, many ways. And the letters, in a sense, to be eavesdropping on this conversation almost 50 years later, now 60 years later, was truly, from a personal standpoint, a joy, but never enough reason to publish a book like this. The second value is the contemporary nature of this history. There have been many wonderful books written about Nuremberg that have really been enlightening and really went into some detail about the history and the background of all of what occurred. What makes this different, in a sense, is that all of those books were written after the fact. They knew the end result, how it was going to work. In a sense, if you read these letters, you begin to appreciate how presumptuous the idea was of this very trial. Remember historically when it happened here. It's April of 1945, the war ends, in the middle of April. Roosevelt dies on April 12th. Truman is the new president. A lot on his desk, a lot to concern himself with and worry about. Roosevelt was for the trial, but not as enthusiastically as Truman was, in effect, in many ways. There were only a handful of people in this country of ours who really believed this would be a worthwhile endeavor. And they're an interesting collection, by the way. It's not the ones you normally expect to be the most strongest advocates for all this. More than half of the Supreme Court was totally opposed to the Nuremberg trials, in a sense, here. In fact, they were very publicly ridiculed Jackson, in a sense, for taking leave of absence and doing this. The strongest advocate, ironically, for the trials was Henry Stimson, the only Republican in Roosevelt's cabinet, the Secretary of War, who really argued very strongly for this trial and believed that the rule of law was critically important to pursue. And then was Sam Rosenman, who was a very good speechwriter for Franklin Roosevelt, also a strong advocate of this. And of course, Robert Jackson, who many consider, next to Oliver Wendell Holmes, probably the most gifted writer in the Supreme Court in the 20th century. A person who had a very limited formal education, by the way. I'm not even sure he graduated from college or law school for that matter, but of course ended up becoming the Solicitor General, the Attorney General of the United States, and a justice on the Supreme Court. And someone my father ended up revering in these letters. And while he's critical from time to time of many others, his respect and admiration for Jackson just grows during those 15 months to the point they almost developed a father-son kind of relationship in this journey that they took. So you begin with a process where there's not great enthusiasm for this idea. And of course that enthusiasm was even less so beyond the borders of our own country. Winston Churchill wanted to summarily execute all of the defendants in Nuremberg. The Soviets wanted a show trial for a week and then execute every one of them. And in a sense, why not, in a way? I suppose, thinking back and trying to imagine how Churchill felt, as my father describes what London looks like here. Certainly even the Soviets, whatever you may think of the Soviets, what they had gone through, the devastation, 20 million lost their lives in the Soviet Union at the time. Why would you ever possibly, what could possibly motivate you to exhaust time, energy, and resources to give these thugs, the worst perpetrators of human rights that anyone had ever recorded in the history of time? Why would you even think about providing these individuals? And to even call them individuals, in a sense, is an outrage. Why would you do this? 55 million had died, 6 million Jews were incinerated, 5 million others faced the same fate for their ethnicity, or their politics, or their sexual orientation. Why would you ever do this? But because there was a handful of people who believed in the rule of law. that we were different, that we were going to show the world we could be different. The British were supportive, but barely so. The French, hardly so. And the Soviets, for all the reasons I've mentioned, were not exactly enthusiastic about this whole idea, and rarely showed up or engaged in a very aggressive way until sort of the end of the trial itself. But because of Robert Jackson, my father, and others, they pursued this goal. At the opening statements at the Nuremberg trials, Robert Jackson, who was brilliant, my father said it to my mother, he speaks with such clarity and simplicity. There's a sentence that I memorized years ago because I thought it just captured the essence of Nuremberg and the rule of law and the importance of it. And the sentence talking about the four nations, the Soviet Union, the British, the French, and ourselves, the Americans, gathered there to do what they did was the following. In fact, you heard bits of it here in this video you saw at the outset of the program this evening. And the sentence is the following: that four great nations, flushed with victory and stung with injury, stayed the hand of vengeance by voluntarily submitting their captive enemies to the judgment of the rule of law, is the most significant tribute that power ever paid to reason. It's a stunning sentence in many ways, and captures really what it is in essence here. That power would pay tribute to reason, in a sense, and by insisting that this process go forward. And so Nuremberg becomes tremendously important as you watch the contemporaneous nature of this unfolding of history. It's the first draft of history, in a sense, and critically important, in my view, for those who want to understand what happened at that time, weeks after the end of the war, where still knowledge of the depths of what had occurred wasn't quite clear. And then to see this unfold, four nations assembling prosecutorial teams, providing attorneys for the defendants at Nuremberg, finding a venue where you could actually hold this trial in a city where there were still 20 to 30,000 corpses in the rubble of Nuremberg, facilities almost non-existent, and infrastructure that could hardly support anything, and yet went forward. Beginning in November, the actual trial, the preparations, of course, in the summer, the spring and summer of that event. There's a third reason and a fourth reason. The third reason, I think, has to do with what's been suggested already in some of the comments this evening, and that is the importance of remembrance, in a sense, here. We even find to this day that there are people around the world, the Ahmadinejad in Iran and elsewhere, who, of course, even hold conferences to deny this event ever occurred. In a sense, had Nuremberg not been, had there not been this effort, beyond the civility of it all, to collect the information, the data, the hard evidence, supplied, by the way, by the very defendants themselves, of what had occurred during this reign of terror, then I think the evidence or the arguments of those who make the case today that this did not occur probably might have more credibility to many people. And so beyond the significance of the history of it all, the fact that there was a time and a place where this evidence was collected, provided by the defendants themselves in Nuremberg, provides an uncontrovertible evidence here of the Holocaust. And while there are certainly those survivors who give personal testimony, in time that will fade. There are fewer and fewer alive every single day. And there'll come generations that will reach back and wonder if, in fact, those who argue that this never occurred were true, were accurate. There is now a body of evidence called the Nuremberg trials, which lays out the evidence in detail. There's that moment that Larry talked about in December of 1945, in the sense, and I heard my father talk about this growing up in addition to the letters, where the trial wasn't going well at all, in effect. It was going downhill. People were getting it bored by it. It was just a boring recitation of data going on and on. Certainly important information. Goering was dominating in the courtroom, in a sense. He was a powerful figure. He had the entire other defendants totally intimidated in the dock. They were frightened to death of what he might say and do. They were unsure this was not going to come back in some ways. Goering's own comments, and they'll be building statues to me 50 years from now. And Goering was an imposing figure in the courtroom. And he sort of engaged in a filibuster in many ways, going on with little or no opposition by the judges to slow him down as he tried to dominate the court. He began to say, look, wars are dreadful things. Terrible things happen in war. Throughout history, we understand this occurs. We lose, you win, there's a trial, in a sense. Is this really justifiable, in a sense, given the nature of wars and all the terrible things that happened during it? And this was beginning to gain credibility and credence with many people. And my father went to Robert Jackson and said, we're not doing well here, in a sense. We're losing the day, to put it mildly. And my father spent so many years as a prosecutor trying cases around the country. Jackson hadn't tried a case in years, of course, although it was brilliant, really hadn't tried a case in a long time. And so my father went to Jackson and said, I want to try a case. I want to try a case as if this were a single homicide. I want to be able to make a case to the international press, to the public at large, and to the judges as well, what happened here. And I never knew this existed until a few months ago when public television actually has filmed footage of this moment. So while I've heard the story and read the letters, I'd never seen the actual moment until public television showed me that it was actually video footage and audio of this moment in December of 1945, where that tablecloth is put out in the middle of the courtroom in Nuremberg, and as any good local prosecutor might do, sits there and points to it and says to that jury of judges, I'm going to show you something here that will tell you more about these defendants in the dock than anything else you will have heard tonight. I just want you to pay attention to this tape, because this will demonstrate, without any equivocation, exactly who we're talking about here, the mentality, the attitudes, and the ideas that they brought to the 13 years of terror. And at that, they got a young officer, a young corporal, pulled back the cloth, and there was the shrunken head, the paperweight on the desk of the commandant at Buchenwald. And you could hear in the video the gasps of people that day. And from that moment forward, the trial changed, in a sense. The ability to focus on one piece of evidence here that demonstrated, without any question whatsoever, the nature of these defendants, who they were and what they had done. So it's important for that reason as well, that we have that time and place of collecting the data information makes the point. But lastly, there's a relevancy to these letters as well. And while all of those reasons are valuable, again, I would suggest to you, I probably wouldn't have gone to Larry and said, does this have value in terms of publication? It's this fourth reason that caused me to ask Larry to make a judgment about the value of these letters. Because in addition to writing to my mother, these are letters to us as well. This is an epistle, in a way, to our generation. Because we today face similar questions being raised about the rule of law and the importance of it. As a free people, we have survived for more than 2 centuries now because each generation has made it their business to protect and defend the rule of law. It's been a remarkable journey, a short one, but a remarkable one. And yet there are those who would suggest to us that we may have to give up rights in order to be more secure as a people. I find that frightening, frankly. I believe if you give up rights, you become far less secure and far more vulnerable. That the rule of law is no more important today, or less important than it was a generation ago. And standing up for the rule of law is what my father and his generation did at a time when vengeance might have prevailed. There are different arguments and different reasons given at different times on why we ought to give up some rights. This is not a time to do so any more than it was then, in a sense. And that reminder that while it was the greatest generation that saved us from the horrors of Nazi Germany and from Imperial Japan, part of that generation also had the good wisdom and sense to see to it that there was justice that came afterwards. And from Nuremberg, all of these other institutions, which have played such a critical role in providing the global sense of global peace, relative global peace, we've had for 60 years. It was from Nuremberg that the Marshall Plan emerged. The Marshall Plan never would have happened without the Nuremberg trials. NATO, the IMF, the World Bank, the UN system, with all of its flaws and all of its imperfections, and all of the things that make us wonder from time to time whether or not these institutions have any value. And yet I think all of us understand deep down that these institutions do provide an opportunity and a means of protecting us and advancing our own issues and causes here. None of that, in my view, ever would have happened. That architecture, those structures, would have never been constructed had we not gained the moral high ground of the Nuremberg trials, in a sense. As a result of that event, those trials, the United States was able to convince a good part of the rest of the world to follow us in building these institutions. And as a result of that, we've enjoyed almost 60 years of relative peace. Certainly, I think it's the reason why we're ultimately effective in defeating the Soviet Union, the Cold War, if you will. And I worry deeply that as we become more isolated, we retreat in a way here from these values and principles, that we once again subject ourselves to the dangers that we saw in previous generations, where we failed to understand the importance of leading and creating these institutions and building that moral authority that Nuremberg gave us more than 60 years ago. So to those who wonder the value of this, they're wonderful letters, it's great history, there's an importance of remembrance and keeping the evidence to demonstrate without any equivocation the existence of the Holocaust. But also, and maybe more importantly than all of those reasons, is the value and the importance of the rule of law, of insisting upon it. There's one letter here that I'll read to you because I think of all the letters here, it's the one I have the most difficulty reading because of its poignancy. But it's almost towards the end of this. It's June, I can find it here quickly, it's June of 1946. And it's my father now knows that this is going to happen, that the trial is going to work, in a sense. These letters are fun in a way, too. I can just hear them because they wander from paragraph to paragraph. And on the one hand, he's talking about Gehring and Keitel and Hess and Keitelberner and the rest. And then he's turning around and wondering whether or not the chickens are being fed, whether or not the shutters are being painted, and what are the children doing in school. And then it's back to Gehring again, going back and forth in this sort of wandering. But this letter he writes at some length, and there's some interesting points to it. But let me just read a couple of paragraphs to you, because this is where I think he understands more than anything else the value of what he's trying to do. It's about 9 p.m. and I'm here with you. I prefer to pass my time with you rather than reading or doing anything. You are so much on my mind at all times. I had a nice letter from Judge Wynn thanking me for a picture I'd sent him. He said he showed it to Judge Jennings. It really is of great importance to everyone. And as Lippmann said, someday it'll be recognized as a great landmark in the struggle of mankind for peace. It is the highest calling of the legal profession, and I'm already proud of my part in it, because of what it has meant and continues to be, sacrifice and struggle. I feel even better about it. And you, dearest, share very much of this sacrifice and struggle. You've made it possible for me to keep on over here. I will never do anything as worthwhile again. Nothing will ever be really as important. Someday the boys will point to it, I hope, and be proud and inspired by it. Perhaps they will be at the bar themselves, and perhaps they will invoke the precedent and call upon the law that we make here. I feel that we are doing something so important that it is awesome. It is almost purifying. It has a deep religious meaning, of that I feel certain. Surely it is God's wish that men not wage wars of aggression. The proof here is absolutely overwhelming. I would never have believed that men could be so evil, so determined on a course of war, of murder, of slavery, of dreadful tyranny. Never before has such a record been written, and men will read about it for 1,000 years in amazement and wonder how it ever happened. Thank you.